Some families are tested by time, others are tested by power. On a quiet afternoon in a small American neighborhood, Marcus Cole was at his parents' front door when two police cruisers rolled up and stopped too close to the curb. The officers stepped out with the kind of confidence that changes the air in a place. Frank Miller led the way, tall, hard-eyed, and already irritated by the sight of a black man who looked calm enough to make him suspicious. Jason Reed followed beside him, younger, trying to look just as sure of himself. Marcus was a big man, broad in the shoulders, heavy-set with a steady face and eyes that missed nothing. He wore a plain navy sweatshirt, khaki pants, and a watch that looked ordinary unless you knew what it meant. Frank looked Marcus up and down and said, "You the one living here?" Marcus answered evenly. "I'm visiting my parents." Frank's mouth twisted into a smirk. "Then you can start by stepping aside." Inside the house, Marcus's elderly parents were near the window, hearing enough to understand that something was wrong. His mother clutched the curtain with trembling fingers. His father stood straighter, though his hand shook around the cane. They were both in their late 70s, tired, gentle, and completely unprepared for the cold attention now fixed on their home. Frank claimed he had received a complaint about suspicious activity. There was no complaint, only assumption, only attitude. Jason glanced toward the front door and said, "Maybe your people just don't know how to keep things quiet." The words hung there, ugly and careless. Marcus didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He simply turned his head and looked at Jason with a stillness that made the younger officer blink first. "You should choose your next words carefully," Marcus said. Frank let out a short laugh, like the warning itself proved Marcus guilty of something. Or what he asked. The neighbors had started peeking through blinds and half-open windows. A woman across the street stood frozen with a grocery bag in one hand. Two kids on bikes slowed down at the corner. The whole block could feel the tension the way it spread before a storm. Frank stepped closer to the front steps and said, "These older folks need help. Maybe we should make sure everything in here is legal." His hand drifted toward the door as if he already owned the right to cross it. Marcus shifted once, just enough to block the entrance without making a scene. "You don't need to go inside," he said. Frank's eyes narrowed. "You telling me what to do?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked past the officers, past the porch toward the quiet street, then back to the man trying to dominate it. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. "I'm telling you to stop." That was when Frank's face hardened. He hated being checked by anyone, and he especially hated being checked by a black man who refused to sound afraid. He took another step close enough that the badge on his chest caught the light. "You got a problem with police?" he asked. Marcus's mother gasped softly from inside. His father's jaw tightened. Marcus heard both of them, and something in his expression changed, just slightly, like a door closing somewhere deep inside. He reached into his pocket slowly. Not fast, not dramatic, just deliberate. Frank and Jason both watched him with sudden caution, expecting a phone, a wallet, maybe a license. But Marcus did not pull out an ID. He held up a black case with a government seal stamped in silver, and then he opened it toward the light. Frank's smirk faded before his eyes finished reading the first line. Jason stopped breathing for a second. Marcus looked directly at them and said, "My name is Marcus Cole. And before you take one more step toward my parents' door, you should know exactly who you're standing in front of." For one long beat, the entire street went silent. Marcus held the open case steady, letting the silver seal catch the porch light as if the night itself had decided to testify. Frank's face lost color first, then Jason's posture changed the way a man stands when he realizes the ground beneath him is not as solid as he thought. For a second, nobody spoke. Even the traffic at the end of the block seemed far away. Inside the house, Marcus's mother pressed a hand to her mouth, and his father stepped closer to the screen door, his eyes fixed on the badge case with a look that was equal parts worry and disbelief. Frank swallowed hard and tried to recover his voice. "What is that supposed to mean?" he asked, but the words came out thinner than before. Marcus did not answer right away. He only let the silence stretch calm and controlled the kind of silence that makes other people reveal themselves. "It means," he said at last, "you came here thinking my parents were easy targets." Jason shifted his weight and glanced toward the father, then the mother, then back to Marcus, as if his mind were racing to rearrange every assumption it had made in the last minute. Frank forced a laugh that did not sound real. "You're still trespassing," he said. "And you're still fat enough to make this a problem for yourself." The insult landed, but it did not break Marcus. If anything, it made him even quieter. He closed the case halfway, then opened it again just enough for both men to see the credentials inside, the kind that were never meant to be displayed casually, the kind that carried a weight beyond the paper and metal. "You keep trying to make this about my size," Marcus said, his voice low and level. because you don't know what else to do with the fact that I'm not scared of you." His mother's eyes filled not with tears yet, but with the strain of watching her son stand there and absorb every word without flinching. She had seen him come home from long deployments with a stillness that made even family conversations feel sacred, but this was different. This was the stillness of a man who had already decided how the night would end. Jason cleared his throat. "Look, man, nobody needs trouble," he said, and for the first time his voice carried uncertainty instead of authority. Frank turned sharply toward him, offended by the softness, but Marcus did not let the moment drift. "Then don't bring trouble to my parents' front door," he said. He took one step down from the porch, placing himself between the officers and the elderly couple inside, not by force, but by presence. It was enough. The little rectangle of light from the doorway framed him like a wall. Frank's eyes flicked to the seal again, then to Marcus's face. And something ugly and unfamiliar rose behind his expression, not anger now, but the first crack of fear. "You know, Marcus said people like you always think respect is something you can demand from the weakest person in the room." He paused, letting that settle. "But the truth is, real respect starts when you realize exactly who you're talking to." From the corner of his eye, Marcus saw his father reach slowly toward the side table just inside the door, where an old photograph sat in a frame beside a folded American flag. His father had not touched the flag. He had only rested his hand near it as if steadying himself against memory. That small gesture seemed to change Marcus's breathing. He looked back at the officers and continued, "My parents are old. They are tired. They deserve peace. And you came here threatening them because you thought nobody would answer for it." Frank's mouth opened, then closed again. Jason stared at the case like it might bite him. Then a new sound rolled down the street, quiet at first, but unmistakable to anyone trained to notice it, the measured approach of another vehicle slowing at the curb. Marcus's eyes shifted for the first time, not in surprise but in recognition. A dark SUV had pulled in behind the patrol car, its headlights sweeping across the houses before cutting out. The driver's door opened. A man in a dark suit stepped out and looked directly toward the porch, his hand already reaching for his phone. Frank saw him and immediately stiffened. Marcus did not move. He only lowered the case slightly and said almost under his breath, "About time." Then the suited man lifted his head, met Marcus's eyes, and spoke one sentence that made both officers freeze where they stood. Marcus did not answer at once. He stood on the porch with that quiet stillness that made the whole scene feel smaller than it had a moment ago, as if the air itself had stepped back to give him room. The suited man looked from Marcus to the officers, then toward the elderly couple inside the doorway, and his expression changed with a slow, careful disbelief. Frank tried to recover, first lifting his chin, as if authority could be rebuilt by posture alone. "Who are you?" he asked, but his voice had lost the sharp edge it had carried earlier. The man in the suit did not look at him. He kept his eyes on Marcus and said with the kind of respect that makes a room go silent, "Sir, the line is confirmed. They're on the property now." Marcus's jaw tightened, not with anger, but with the burden of hearing that sentence out loud. Behind him, Mrs. Ellis clutched the porch rail with trembling fingers, while Mr. Ellis stared at the dark SUV as though he could not decide whether to fear it or trust it. The man in the suit stepped closer, lowered his phone, and spoke again. "Your parents are safe, Commander, but I need to know if you want this handled here or at the federal level." Jason blinked hard, his face draining of color. Frank's shoulders stiffened. The words had landed like a bell in an empty courthouse. "Commander, not a nickname, not a guess, a title." Marcus finally turned his head slightly enough to let the porch light catch the calm, hard line of his face. "I wanted this handled quietly," he said, "but they made it public the moment they came to my parents' door." Mrs. Ellis looked at him, then really looked at him, like a mother seeing a son all over again and a stranger at the same time. "Baby," she whispered, almost afraid to ask, "what is he talking about?" Marcus reached into the case he had been holding so carefully and set it on the porch table beside the Bible and the old family photo. The metal latches clicked once under his thumb. He did not open it yet. He only kept his hand on it steady and sure while the suited man spoke into the phone in a low voice. Somewhere down the block, another car door opened. Then another. The quiet neighborhood was beginning to fill with the kind of footsteps that do not hurry, because they already know they have arrived in time. Frank swallowed and took one uncertain step backward, suddenly aware that he had been standing in front of the wrong house with the wrong tone in front of the wrong people. Jason stared at Marcus's case, then at the porch, then at the man in the suit, and finally managed to whisper, "What exactly are you?" Marcus let the question hang there for a beat long enough for the answer to feel heavier than any shout. Then he looked toward his parents, toward the officers, and said, "I'm the reason nobody gets to keep hurting my family once the truth comes out." The suited man nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and lifted his phone again. "Sir," he said, "the director wants to speak with you now." Marcus's fingers tightened on the latches, and for the first time that night, both officers saw the case in his hands, not as an object, but as the beginning of the thing they were already too late to stop. Marcus did not move right away. He stood on the porch in the cold night air, the weight of his sealed case steady in his hand, while the two officers across from him seemed to shrink under the realization that the scene had changed, and they had not. The man in the suit remained near the walkway, one hand still resting lightly on his phone, his expression unreadable now that the first shock had passed. Behind Marcus, his mother was still at the doorway, one hand pressed to her chest, her breathing uneven from the stress of the last few minutes. His father stood beside her, silent but upright, the kind of silence that came from a man who had lived long enough to know that the most dangerous thing in any room was often not anger, but patience. Marcus lowered his eyes to the latches of the case, then looked back at Jason and the younger officer who had gone pale in the porch light. "You came here thinking this was a family you could pressure," Marcus said quietly. "You saw an older couple, a fat black man, a small house, and you made your decision before you knew a single fact." Jason swallowed hard his badge, suddenly looking less like authority and more like something borrowed from a life he did not deserve. He tried to speak, but the words would not come. Marcus took one slow step forward, and both officers reacted as if the porch itself had tilted. "My parents have spent their whole lives teaching me that dignity matters," he said. "That even when people disrespect you, you do not give them your soul in return. So no, I am not going to yell. I am not going to threaten you. I am going to let the truth do what it always does." The suited man finally spoke, calm and formal. "The director is still on the line, sir. He asked me to confirm one thing before he joins us." He glanced at the two officers, then back to Marcus. "He wants to know if the men standing here were identified by name before they came onto federal property." The words landed like a quiet hammer. Jason's eyes flicked toward the walkway, as if he suddenly expected the ground to give way beneath him. "Federal property," he said too fast. Marcus did not answer him directly. Instead, he looked at the officer's hands, then at the patrol car idling at the curb, then past them to the street where the neighborhood had started to gather behind curtains and half-open doors. A screen door creaked. Someone's porch light turned on. The night had become a witness. "You really should have asked permission before you came this far," Marcus said. Then he turned the case slightly, and for the first time the officers noticed the tiny engraved plate near the handle, polished enough to catch the light. "Naval Special Warfare Command." Jason's mouth opened in disbelief. The younger officer actually stepped back. Marcus saw it all, and for a moment his expression softened, not with mercy but with something colder and more painful. "I spent years learning how to move quietly," he said. "How to observe first. How to protect the people who raised me before anyone ever noticed I was the one standing in the room." His mother's hand slipped into his father's, steadying both of them now, as if the truth itself had finally become a shield. The suited man looked down at his phone again and raised his eyebrows slightly. "Sir," he said, "the director says, this just became much bigger than a complaint call." Marcus looked at the officers one more time, and in that still measured gaze was the first unmistakable sign that the case in his hand was no longer merely locked. It was about to open. The room had gone very still, the kind of stillness that only comes after a truth has walked in and sat down without asking permission. Marcus remained in the same place, broad shoulders, squared his face, calm, in a way that made the officers uneasy, because calm men rarely had nothing left to say. His father was breathing a little easier now, though the tremor in his hands had not fully disappeared. His mother stood beside him with her chin raised, exhausted but unbroken. The kind of dignity that no badge could erase and no accusation could truly touch. The suited man from the hallway kept one eye on his phone and the other on the officers, as if measuring exactly how far this moment was about to spread. Jason shifted again now, looking less like a man in control and more like someone beginning to understand that control was slipping away from him in real time. One of the younger deputies tried to speak, then stopped when the older officer lifted a hand, not in command anymore, but in caution. Marcus finally moved, taking a slow step forward, then another until he was close enough that the officers had to look up at him. "You came into my parents' home," he said quietly, "and treated them like they were invisible." His voice was low even, and somehow that made it heavier. "You saw age, you saw size, you saw skin, and you decided that was all you needed to know." The older officer swallowed hard. Somewhere outside, a vehicle door closed, then another, and the sound carried down the hallway like an answer arriving early. The suited man looked up from his phone and said almost under his breath, "They're here." No one asked who. They already knew. Marcus turned slightly toward his parents, checking on them with one glance, and his expression changed just enough to show what he had been holding back. Not anger, not fear. Something more disciplined than either. "I've spent enough years in silence to know when a line has been crossed," he said. "And now every person in this room is going to learn exactly who they chose to overlook." At that, the younger officer's radio crackled to life, then went silent as if even the equipment had paused to listen. The suited man took one final look at his screen, and the words that seemed to steady the air around him came out with a gravity that made everyone else freeze. "Sir," he said, "Naval Special Warfare Command just confirmed the name on the file, and they're asking why your parents were targeted in the first place." Marcus did not move right away. He stood there in the narrow light of the hallway, his broad shoulders still, his face unreadable, while the room around him seemed to shrink under the weight of what had just been said. His parents sat close together on the worn bench by the wall, his mother's hands folded tight in her lap, his father staring down at the floor, as if the only way to survive this moment was to keep breathing and say nothing. That silence was the kind that came after humiliation, after people had already decided who mattered and who did not. The officers had spent the last several minutes treating the elder couple like an inconvenience, like names on a problem that could be pushed aside. But now the air had changed. The suited man's voice had carried a different kind of authority, and even the younger officer, who had been trying so hard to act confident, had gone pale around the mouth. Marcus finally took one slow step forward, then another. His black shoes made almost no sound against the tile, but somehow everyone heard them. "Confirm it again," Marcus said quietly. The suited man did not hesitate. He looked down at the tablet in his hands, then back up at Marcus, and his posture straightened as if he had just entered a room full of generals. "Yes, sir," he said. "The file matches. The service record is active. Naval Special Warfare Command has your status listed under restricted verification, but your identity is not in doubt." The younger officer let out a small laugh that sounded nervous rather than cruel. "Come on," he muttered, glancing from Marcus to the tablet and back again. "That's impossible." Marcus turned his head just enough to look at him, and that was all it took to drain the color from the officer's face. It was not a glare. It was worse. It was the look of a man who had spent years learning how to stay calm when other people lost control. "You said my parents were suspicious," Marcus said. "You said they had no right to be here. You treated them like strangers in a place where they belong." His mother's eyes lifted at that glossy with hurt she had been trying not to show. His father said nothing, but his jaw tightened with the quiet dignity of a man who had lived long enough to know that sometimes silence is the last thing they can take from you. The suited man stepped closer, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves deserved respect. "Sir, there's more," he said. "The local department isn't the only office that got involved." He held the tablet out just enough for Marcus to see the screen, then angled it away from everyone else. "This call came in from Norfolk, and it pulled your sealed file forward. Someone above the chain asked why your parents were being watched at all." The room seemed to inhale at once. One of the officers shifted uncomfortably near the doorway, suddenly very aware of the cameras outside the neighbors across the street, the implications of every word spoken in this house. Marcus lowered his gaze to the screen, reading only for a second before his expression sharpened. "They touched the wrong household," he said. The words were not loud, but they landed like a verdict. His mother looked up at him, worried now for reasons deeper than the evening's cruelty. "Marcus," she whispered, "what does that mean?" He turned toward her, and when he did, the hardness in his face softened into something far more human. He knelt beside her chair so that his height no longer separated them, and the whole room seemed to lean in. "It means," he said, "this was never supposed to happen to you." The suited man swallowed hard. He was still holding the tablet, but now his hands looked less like they belonged to a witness and more like they belonged to someone standing at the edge of a much larger storm. "There's another layer, sir," he said. "Your name was not just confirmed. It triggered a second flag. Naval Special Warfare is asking for immediate confirmation on your deployment history." Marcus stayed kneeling, his eyes fixed on his mother's face for one heartbeat longer. Then he looked back to the tablet. The younger officer, who had spent the beginning of the night speaking too loudly and too carelessly, finally took a step back. "What kind of flag?" he asked, barely above a whisper. The suited man looked at him once, then returned his attention to Marcus. "The kind," he said, "that only appears when someone in your file has been kept out of public view for a reason. They are no longer asking whether you are who you say you are, sir. They are asking why your classified record was used to open a domestic inquiry on your own parents." Marcus rose slowly to his feet, And in that movement, there was nothing rushed, nothing wasted, only the steady control of a man who had spent his life preparing for a moment like this, without ever knowing the faces in the room would be his own family. His eyes moved from the officers to the tablet to the old couple on the bench, and when he spoke again, his voice was low enough to feel private and yet strong enough to command the whole house. "Then call them back," he said, "and tell them to bring the full file." The room seemed to hold its breath after Marcus spoke. No one moved. The officers stood frozen near the conference table, their earlier arrogance drained away and replaced by something far less comfortable. The realization that this was no longer a routine complaint, no longer a story they could smooth over with a few words and a closed file. Mrs. Turner sat very still on the bench, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on her son, with a look that was part fear and part trust, the kind only a mother can carry when she has spent years watching a child become a man she has not yet fully had the chance to understand. Mr. Turner kept his chin lifted, but his breathing had changed. It was shallow now, cautious, as if even the air in the building had become uncertain. The suited man nodded once and stepped closer to the tablet, turning it so Marcus could see the digital header across the top of the screen. There were redacted blocks, reference codes, dates, and a set of jurisdiction markers that did not belong in a local police station. This was federal. This was protected. This was the kind of record that only existed when someone had spent years under a level of scrutiny most people would never know was even possible. One officer swallowed hard and tried to recover his voice. "Sir," he said, but the word cracked halfway through. "We were told there was a concern about identity verification. We were told to bring in the family for clarification." Marcus looked at him without blinking. "By who?" he asked. The officer glanced at the suited man, then at the tablet, then at the floor. He had no answer that would sound clean enough to survive the moment. The suited man answered for him. "By someone who should never have had access to this file in the first place," he said. His tone was calm, but there was steel under it. "Someone pulled an old domestic flag attached to your parents' address and triggered an inquiry that should have stopped at a desk review. Instead, it was allowed to reach a public detention room." The words hung there like a verdict. Marcus slowly turned to his father and mother. His voice softened immediately, as if all the command in the world could not compete with the instinct to steady the people who raised him. "You both, all right?" he asked. Mrs. Turner gave the smallest nod, though tears were beginning to gather in her eyes. "We're here," she said quietly. "That's all that matters." But Marcus could see what the morning had done to them anyway. The confusion, the shame of being treated like a problem, the humiliating silence forced on good people who had done nothing wrong. It sat on his face for just a second, then disappeared behind the same disciplined calm he wore like armor. The suited man tapped the tablet again and enlarged another page. This one was older, stamped with a black bar across the top and a chain of references that went through federal channels. Marcus did not say aloud. "There's more," he said. "The inquiry wasn't just about your parents. It tied into a dormant security review from years ago. That means whoever activated it wasn't simply checking a name. They were looking for a connection." One officer looked up sharply. A connection to what the suited man's expression did not change. "To a sealed operational history," he said. "And to a man the local system was never meant to flag in the first place." Marcus felt the words settle into place before they had even fully landed. Not because he was surprised, but because deep down he had already understood that this was never only about his parents standing in the wrong room at the wrong time. It was about him, about a file, about a hidden name, about why a routine stop had escalated into something that clearly reached far beyond city lines. He took one slow step toward the table, then another, and when he reached the edge of the tablet's glow, he stopped. "Who opened it?" he asked. No one answered immediately. The silence this time was different. It was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of fear. Then from the hallway outside came the distinct sound of hurried footsteps, followed by a voice at the door asking for immediate clearance to enter the room. The suited man straightened. The officers turned. And Marcus, still standing between his parents and the hidden truth buried inside that file, looked toward the sound with the steady patience of a man who had just learned the next name was about to matter far more than the last. Marcus did not move when the footsteps stopped outside the room. He only stood there tall and still between his parents and the table where the open file waited under the cold glow of the tablet. The suited man at the door showed his credentials first, then stepped aside for the woman behind him, whose expression carried the kind of urgency that did not belong to ordinary police business. She was not there to ask questions lightly. She was there because something had just crossed a line that no one in that room had expected to be crossed. The older officers straightened without being told. Even the detective near the wall lowered his eyes for half a second, as if he already knew the name on the file had pulled in someone much higher than the local chain of command. Marcus heard it before anyone said it aloud, the soft click of a portable hard case being set on the table, followed by the measured tone of a voice that had already decided this was no longer a matter of routine paperwork. "We need every copy," the woman said. Now, his mother let out a quiet breath, one hand resting against her chest, while his father kept his chin lifted trying to stay calm, even though his shoulders had begun to tense again. Marcus did not look back at them yet. He kept his gaze on the file, on the pages that had been pulled from a place no one in this room was supposed to know about. There, buried in the middle of the documents, was a name that seemed to explain everything and nothing at once. A training record, a clearance trail, a deployment reference marked with a number that made the suited man's face change the moment he read it. The woman noticed that change immediately. "You recognize it," she said. It was not a question. He swallowed and nodded once. "I recognize the channel," he answered. "I do not recognize why it is being used here." That was enough to make the room go quiet again. The kind of quiet that settles when everyone understands they are standing too close to a truth that has been protected for a very long time. Marcus finally spoke, his voice low and even. "Start from the beginning," he said. The woman turned toward him, studying him. Not as a suspect, not as a son, but as a man whose calm had become its own kind of authority. She opened the hard case and removed a sealed envelope, then a second folder, both marked with the same internal stamp. "Your parents were not the target by accident," she said. "They were the pressure point. Whoever made this move was trying to force a response from someone who was expected to stay hidden." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His mother's hand slipped from her chest to the edge of the chair, gripping it gently, while his father's eyes moved from the envelope to Marcus, and then back again, as if trying to piece together a story they had been living inside, without fully knowing it. The woman slid one document forward. On it was a chain of names, dates, and assignments, each one leading to the next, like steps across a dark river. The final line had been highlighted in red. It identified the operational status of one man who until that moment had still been listed under a name that belonged to a life no longer visible on the surface. The suited man looked up, his voice suddenly lower. "If this file is authentic," he said, "then the person standing in this room is not the only one they failed to identify correctly." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, meaning the woman did not answer right away. Instead, she turned the tablet so everyone in the room could see the next page. It showed a contact tree. Not local, not even state level. Federal, military, quiet lines of command that ran far beyond the station, far beyond the city, and far beyond the people who had thought they were in control only minutes ago. At the bottom of the page was one final notation entered less than an hour earlier. It said that a direct call had already gone out to confirm the presence of the man whose name had been hidden in plain sight. Marcus looked at the notation, then slowly lifted his eyes to the woman. "Who called it in?" he asked. Her answer landed with the weight of something far larger than a report. "Someone who knew exactly where you were supposed to be when this happened." And as the room absorbed that truth, the woman reached into the hard case one more time and drew out a second envelope thinner than the first, with a single handwritten label on the front that made Marcus go completely still. Marcus did not speak for a long moment. He only stared at the second envelope, then at the woman, then back again, as if his body understood the truth before his mind was willing to name it. The room had gone so quiet that even the hum of the lights felt loud. Then he took the envelope, broke the seal with careful fingers, and opened it. Inside was a single card, cream-colored, clean-edged, with one handwritten line that made the air in the room feel suddenly thinner. "Protection detail approved. Family extraction in motion." His jaw tightened, not with fear, but with a kind of hard, controlled grief that only comes when a man realizes the line between duty and home has just been crossed. He turned the card over once, then looked toward the window where the parking lot lights glowed against the dark. Somewhere beyond that glass were the people who had thought a badge gave them permission to decide who mattered. Somewhere beyond that glass were the officers who had laughed, pointed, and assumed the world would always stay small enough for their prejudice. The woman in the suit did not rush him. She simply said, "Your parents are safe now." That sentence hit harder than any shouted order ever could. Marcus shut his eyes for one brief second, and in that silence the whole weight of the day pressed through him. The humiliation his mother had carried in her trembling hands, the quiet shame his father had swallowed, Without a word, the long road that had brought them to this room, to this paperwork, to this final turning point where helplessness stopped and consequence began. When he opened his eyes again, there was nothing uncertain in them, only purpose. The woman slid a second sheet across the table. It was the official notification that the local department's conduct review would be converted into a federal inquiry with internal affairs, military oversight, and civilian witnesses all required to appear. Every name, every time stamp, every statement, all of it would be examined, not hidden, not softened, not buried. Marcus read it once, then again, and the room seemed to straighten around him. For the first time that night, he exhaled slowly. Not because the pain was gone, it wasn't, but because pain was no longer the final word. The door opened behind them, and two uniformed federal agents stepped in carrying a sealed file box and a small canvas bag. One of them nodded to Marcus with the kind of respect that does not need explanation. "Your parents are already on their way here," he said. "A private transport has been arranged. They wanted to see you first." Marcus stood so quickly the chair legs scraped the floor. In that instant, the steel in him broke open just enough for the truth to show. He was not just a son trying to clean up a mess. He was a man who had spent years learning how to survive in silence, now standing at the edge of the only victory that mattered. When his parents finally arrived, his mother's hands were still unsteady, but her face changed the moment she saw him. His father, tired and quiet and proud, in the way older men often are held. Marcus in a long, wordless embrace. No one in the room spoke. No one needed to. The apology had already begun. The healing had already started. And outside, the night kept moving indifferent and cold, while inside those four walls something older than anger was taking its place: dignity. The investigation would not erase what had been done. Nothing could. But it would name it. It would document it. It would force the people who had looked down on others to finally face a truth they had spent their lives avoiding. Marcus sat between his parents, one hand resting on each of theirs, and for a while he simply listened to their breathing. That was enough. That was everything. Because in the end, the law had not arrived as thunder. It had arrived as memory, as paperwork, as a sealed envelope, as a federal seal on the table, as a son standing up for the people who first taught him what honor meant. And the lesson the room carried into the dark was simple and permanent: when power forgets compassion, justice does not disappear. It waits.